when you're dealing with character disordered people, it's the lists are very simple: insincere, fake personality.
Mhm.
Do they feel like they're trying to sell you something? Like, why do I always feel like you're trying to sell me on some sort of proposition? A tendency to um, have outbursts and insults and emotional reactions where they're constantly coming back. Failure to take personal responsibility is a huge one. If in every given situation is somebody is not taking personal responsibility, it's always someone else's fault, always some other story. That's a big one. And then eventually you get to the point of physical violence, where they go from expressive violence, which is yelling and insulting and making excuses for their behavior, to where it turns physical. But if you can realize who these people are in advance and keep them out of your life, and I know it's hard to do with family sometimes, and that's a call every individual has to make on their own. But I do think it's important sometimes, if you have a family member like that, just to create really strong boundaries from your family and them. And just, if that person's going to be in your life or they're going to be around, you're going to have a conversation with them about how they're allowed to act and how they're not allowed to act. And if they're not going to engage in that, I think you have to sometimes separate yourself from those kind of people.
And what did you learn in your research about how these character disorders, as you call them, develop? Is this something people are born with? Is it something that's developed through, I don't know, family role modeling, trauma, stuff like that?
Yeah, everything I've read over the years, it it seems pretty clear to me that it's always a case of both. And it's very hard to put a number on that, nature, nurture. But generally speaking, I think the more studies that come out and the more we read about it, the more I see about it, the more we start to realize how much of it actually is nature and how many things really are inherited traits that we might not even think of as an inherited trait, really idiosyncratic, strange behavior that, actually was something that wasn't necessarily learned. But at the same time, you also usually have an environment where the individual grew up where they were exposed to that as well. That's how they learned to socialize. Maybe their parents were that way. So it's almost always, I think, a combination of nature nurture. I think you have two different types. So you'll have the most common type, which is a reactive aggressive. And a reactive aggressive is somebody who's going to lash out. They're going to be quick tempered. They're not going to take personal responsibility. They're going to go for your weak points. They're going to berate you. And that's the most common type. And that's where there'll be a heated argument. And all of a sudden it turns violent. And that's where the police will wind up having to show up to a domestic dispute, and there's two brothers fighting, or there's a husband battling with a wife or something like that. And that's the majority of who we see in prison, is reactive aggressives. And there, from a nature standpoint, I do think that it's pretty clear that there's something going on with the prefrontal cortex and um, a lack of empathy, impulse control,
Hmm.
um, a failure to be able to push that pause button. And so that is definitely hardwired in many ways. And then on the other side of that, you have people who use violence in a very instrumental way, and they can be far more dangerous. And that's where we're talking about legitimate psychopaths, the sociopaths. But they're also, I think those people are also actually quite rare. There's not that many of them around. And the interesting thing, I didn't get too much into this in the book, but when you start to study about that, the interesting thing is the areas where reactive aggressive criminals might have deficiencies in that prefrontal cortex and inability to restrain themselves. The people who are true high level sociopaths and psychopaths, that part of their brain actually lights up even more. Like very high functioning, like the Ted Bundy archetype of that, or so. But the odds of running into somebody like that are quite small.
And how does the prefrontal cortex factor in? And in terms of I think you describe it as abnormalities, and sometimes if it is damaged, I think that it can cause these kinds of character disorders in some way. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Um, I think part of it can be inherited. I think part of it, nature is born, but it also can be exacerbated by drinking during pregnancies, drugs during pregnancies,
Mm.
abuse. So all those factors come into play. I mean, if you have, let's say, worst case scenario, you have very aggressive, reactive aggressive parents or father or mother who has poor impulse control. They have a child, they pass along a lot of those traits. They're abusive to that child. They drink heavily during the pregnancy. Maybe they've taken some drugs during the pregnancy as well. All of that we know too also damages that part of the brain, and could cause a lot of damage to that part of the brain. And now you have a child that's got the worst of both worlds. They've gotten um, the worst of nature and nurture, and you get kids out there who really do lack self-awareness, empathy, and impulse control. And the one thing I tried to get across in the book, my first big, I think, realization when I started to look at the data was problems related to the root cause, I believe, of most of what we call problematic violence. So in the book, I'm talking about interpersonal violence, not warfare and terrorism and things like that. And interpersonal violence every year, generally speaking, kills 4 times as many people as war. So, and that's crime and abuse and that kind of thing. And the major issue, as I believe, as it relates to interpersonal violence, the major problems are issues related to maturity. And I still think you have a lot of people in this out there, a lot of politicians, a lot of other people who believe they're economic, and that people are engaging in many of these activities because they're going hungry or they need food, or even, trying to get money to buy drugs. And while all those things can play a role, the biggest, if you talk to the police officers and you look at the data, and the biggest category for homicide in this country are fatherless young men killing other fatherless young men between the ages of 16 and 22, 23. That's by far the largest age group, over issues related to status, petty
Mm.
issues related to status. And that general lack of um, maturity, which I define as self-awareness, empathy, and impulse control. And it's dangerous when you have a lot of these young men all together raising themselves, absent many strong male role models. They're going to form gangs, and this is what we see now. And the only short-term solution that we have for it, to put a stop to it in the beginning, is more police. And then when we find the repeat violent offenders, by the time one of them shoots another one, they've usually been arrested 11 to 12 times. They've already been convicted of multiple felonies. It's already illegal for them to carry a weapon, but they've been caught and released in kind of a revolving door, and then eventually they kill someone. But almost all of those crimes, if you go back and check, were crimes related to status, respect amongst their peer group. Um, that is the biggest portion of the violence. When we see the huge spike that we've seen in this country in the last 2 years since the summer of 2019, that's what that spike is. That's young men killing other young men over status.